DJ Esports is the world's only crypto esports odds matrix, and right now they're running a tournament called the DJ Esports Worlds Prediction Series. Don't be put off by the fact it has Worlds in the title. Yes, League of Legends Worlds is a game you can bet on. You can bet on the Dota 2 the International, Blast, CSGO Major and CSGO, but you can bet on your beloved Valorant. So for example, the competition was actually running during the VCT Berlin. So in theory, cause it's free to enter and you get the tokens, 400 DJ each by signing up to the site. You can get 800 more if you go on the Discord and message the mod mail. It's basically, you make a bunch of bets using the tokens, and then it's a prediction competition. You get on a leaderboard, and then the winners get massive prize purses, $10 million USDT prize pool. So interestingly enough, if you'd have bet on your beloved Sentinels or G2, riding it like a fucking fanboy, it actually wouldn't have mattered. You wouldn't have lost real money. Yeah, you wouldn't have won the competition, but then again, level up, see who actually is going to win, watch all the regions. Because interestingly enough, you could win up to 800,000 USDT. By the way, Hiko's career winnings over all games is only about 232,000. So you'd win almost more, something like just under 3.5 times what Hiko won in his career. Okay, so who is Hiko? I'm talking about, obviously, the current Valorant pro, but since you little kids in Valorant who don't necessarily know CS, or you only know a bit about the end of CS because you swapped over to try and get good in Valorant, since you are playing Babby's first FPS, but there's a bunch of veterans, people like Hiko, legend of CSGO, some of the newer players and talents that were rising, talents the like of 10s, etc., that come over, even people who were sort of on the cusp of being very good a few years ago. Ethan, almost ready to become a star player in the world. I thought I'll educate you guys by telling you who these guys were in CSGO, because Hiko was one of the best NA CSGO players of all time. When I did a video with Scoots' Do Not Peak Productions, I actually ranked him in early 2020 number 2 all time out of NA players. And by the way, he wasn't that relevant as an NA player from about late 2016 onwards. So that's even with Team Liquid coming along and having the Grand Slam and Cloud9 winning the major. Still had him number 2 because of what this guy accomplished over his career, and he was fabulous in the early part of CSGO. He actually had, interestingly, until 2018, till Cloud9 won the Boston Major, he had the best resume at the majors, our World Championships in CSGO, of any NA player. He boasted 2 semi-final appearances and 1 final. Now, interestingly enough, in Valorant, I don't follow Valorant much, but I keep up on the news, I check out who's in the tournaments, I see what the hype is, what the clips are, and I noticed, okay, in Valorant, this is a guy where he's been around since June of last year. He's in a team, obviously, in 100T's now, that has former CSGO players. Nitro from Team Liquid, Ethan from EG, Steel, formerly of iBuyPower, obviously had the band. Then he was in Ghost Gaming towards the end. So the interesting thing to me, obviously Steel's being kicked. Obviously, Hiko's team managed to get top 4 at VCT Berlin, which was a LAN. I don't know much about Valorant, so on the Wikipedia it said he's a Sova and a Viper player, so I'll believe that. I saw an interesting Clutch movie where it's a bunch of like stream clips and stuff, but it looks like he's maintained one of his main themes, which was he was a very clutch lurker in CSGO. It's what made him actually quite famous, especially in the early years. So his CS background rather goes back before CSGO. It goes to 1.6 and the latter years, the last sort of year and a half, if you want to talk about actually getting to like top level, the invite level in NA, and then truly getting a chance to maybe be on the international level, which he never really got to do because they just weren't NA teams that had the sponsorship to travel at that time. So he was on a team called Check 6, which actually was more famous for the other names in the team because it had Storm and Fraud, who'd been on one of the best NA teams ever, Complexity, which had won ESWC, one of the majors, back in 2005. It had XP3, who was actually a French player who'd been on Against All Authority and had like, I think, a top 4 run at like CPL Winter 2006, but then he'd come over to NA to live. I think he lived in Canada maybe. I assume he went with where the Quebecois were. And then it also, and I think it was the IGL, and then it also had a guy called Dizzaman, who I wasn't that familiar with. He was more of just like an invite level player. So in this period though, they went to the ESEA Invite Season 10 LAN Finals and they managed to finish 3rd, which is pretty good. It's not the best, obviously. At this time, NA wasn't super competitive, but it showed they could still sort of hang to some degree. When CSGO began, Hiko was right on it. He was in the best NA team immediately, which was Area 51, featuring Sean Gares, his later in-game leader in Cloud9, Dazed, the in-game leader later on of Quantic, and obviously was in iBuyPower, Semphis, who was going to be with him in Complexity later, and TCK, who was a guy I think also came from Source with Dazed, and was more of like a supportive element. Now, in the first year of CSGO, they went to ESWC with this team and they finished third, which is actually a monster performance. Because remember, the best teams in the world were NIP and Very Games by a decent margin. But to get this third place finish, they had to beat out a bunch of European teams and place ahead of a bunch of bigger names, actually. So already you saw there was definitely potential in this lineup. And as I alluded to, they sort of just split in half and made two teams later, which became Complexity/Cloud9 and iBuyPower. So you had the Quantic team the next year, which was the same team, but Sean Gares went away, and in came a guy called Frost, who, as far as I know, was an Source player who was an AWPer. Now, they actually had immediately a pretty good run, because what people don't know behind the scenes is the team was basically going to break apart. They'd already decided, like, Days wanted to kick Semphis, who kind of had like a Kobe-Shaq relationship, couldn't coexist. Hiko just wanted to stay wherever he could win. So in this particular scenario, because they were sort of like on the way out, sometimes semi-dead teams, because people just think, well, fuck it, we'll play out the lands, it makes you kind of play without pressure. So at Copenhagen Games, they managed to actually finish top 6 at a super stacked event with all the best European teams. At ESEA Season 13, which this time had NIP, the best team in the world, coming over unbeaten, and actually maybe that might have been, I think that was the one that was actually when they were still unbeaten. Had Very Games, second, third, fourth, top 4 team in the world, basically, with Scream and Kenny S and Existence. And at this LAN, they actually managed in Quantic to 2-0 Very Games in the lower bracket final and make the final where they couldn't beat NIP. So they finished second, but this was a decent performance. This wasn't just an NA ESEA LAN, but then the team was torn in half. Now, interestingly, Hiko actually chose to go over to Complexity with Semphis, a guy I liked playing with. And in this team, you had Sean Gares as the in-game leader. You had Nothing, the former sort of star and rising star from the end of CS 1.6, who'd been like the NA hope. You had Swag, who was like a much younger, kind of on track to be what Nothing was going to be at the end of 1.6. Clearly had the skills, but was very, very young. And you had Hiko to go along with Sean Gares and Semphis. So you actually had a nice mix of skill, like Swag and Hiko were really skilled at this time. Nothing was sort of in the middle, kind of like your third star, who maybe has a good game sometimes. And then Sean Gares and Semphis were more the supportive elements. So the next ESEA, they managed to finish second, but this was the one where only really NIP came in. If people remember, there's a famous story of Very Games said it was like too expensive and wasn't worth, and they got like semi-banned, I think, from ESEA maybe briefly. Then they went to ESWC, which at the time, this is before the majors, was still actually a pretty big tournament. They made top 8, but I think they had to play NIP or something in the quarterfinals. So again, NIP at this time was actually technically becoming the second best team, but still an elite European team. Then the first major happened, DreamHack Winter 2013. And with the group they actually had Very Games in their group. And at the time, Very Games was now number 1 in the world. They'd taken over from NIP. So at the time, actually, everyone thought, right, well, they're going to come second in their group, which means they have to play first from another group, which means it's going to be super hard because that'll probably be an NIP, Astana Dragons, maybe Copenhagen Wolves. In this scenario, they're kind of in trouble, right? But actually, they managed to win the best of 1 against Very Games, win their group, then they had to go anyway and play Astana Dragons, it turned out. So as a result, they had to play like a top third best team in the world at the time, but they beat them in the series. In the semi-finals, they faced a surprised Fnatic and kind of got tooled because Pronax basically outcalled Sean Gares massively. But they finished top 4 at the first major, when on paper, top 8 or slightly maybe even be challenged for the group stage was mainly the expectation. Now, interestingly, at the end of 2013, you played for just over a year, like a year and a quarter, a year and a half maybe. Hiko was the best NA player at this time and would largely, if you consider most of 2014, continue for the first 2 or so years. He was a very good fragger. He had massive fragging numbers. He was a really good lurker, which is how he got a lot of his frags, but he played it very masterfully because he was a super clutch player, especially for an NA player, and he was a pretty good pistol player too. Hitch on TV at the end of 2013 actually ranked him their 9th best player of the year, which is a very high rating for an NA player, but he put up the numbers. Then obviously, next year, they go to the ESEA, which is one where Titan and iBuyPower's battled, and basically iBuyPower upset them, but on NA soil in an event that doesn't have a big crowd. They finished third, which is what you'd expect. Then came the next major, the second major in CSGO, EMS won Katowice, later to be obviously ESL won and IEM Katowice. They made top 8, but they had to play NIP again, and NIP was a very, very good team. They made the final, basically torching most teams. At least this team, Complexity, took a map off NIP. Then there was another ESEA. This was one that was really stacked, and actually the NA teams both surprised. iBuyPower won again. By now they'd already taken Swag from Complexity, and basically Complexity was actually able to beat NIP, who had the real lineup and never placed below top 4. They beat Na'Vi, who I think Edward arrived late or something, and then they beat Virtus Pro, who I think maybe it was like Snacks or Bialy also like had a late arrival or something bizarre like that. So there was some circumstance that would extenuate, but these were massive scalps to claim. They basically claimed the EU scalps, and iBuyPower just kind of sat in the final and beat Complexity basically. Then they got bought out by Cloud9. They became Cloud9 and they brought in Shroud. I think maybe this is when Swag, I can't remember which order it was. I think maybe this was, I know this is when basically Shroud came around the lineup at this time, because I think that previous line was when he was on Man and Juma or whatever at that line. So they go to the major, which is the big event here, ESL1 Cologne 2014. And even though they only on paper finished 5th to 8th, what they did at this major was epic. Because at the time, the iBuyPower guys, and some of the former Curse NA and stuff, they were famous for always bombing it at the EU lands. Whereas actually the Complexity Cloud9 core sometimes would be second in NA, but then they'd be the better team internationally. So they got out of what was basically a group you weren't supposed to get out of. There was Dignitas, who'd been top 4 at the last major, and they were supposed to win this particular game. Hiko did the epic, like, Hiko, are you kidding me? Like this mega round that he did on Mirage. They had Titan, who at the time was also, like, let's say, 5th best team in the world or something, a pretty good squad. They weren't supposed to be able to get out a group with them in as well. When they got to the quarterfinals, they actually placed a really flagging NIP, and they made it all the way to the 3rd map, and the randomizer, because there was a randomizer in this major that was introduced that just randomized out the last 3 maps, picked Cobblestone, a brand new map that was broken and isn't the later version of Cobblestone, had this broken wall area, which was a terrible CT-sided map. And believe it or not, Nip pulled out the ultimate miracle and won it 16-14 at the very end of regulation. If that doesn't happen, and if the randomizer even picks a different map, I personally think Complexity, Cloud9 now rather, wins this series. LDLC in the semis wasn't the one later with Shocks and MBK. This would have been a really close semi-final. Maybe they go out there, but that would be top 4 again. There's a world in which they could have gone to the final. I do think Fnatic would probably have beaten them in the final. Fnatic already, this was their second event with that lineup, but it was the lineup that basically became the Fnatic era late in the year or late next year or early next year, depending on when you define that. So they could have come second at a major, even in the 3rd major ever held. Then unfortunately, the team sort of fell off after that massive run. Like by the time they got to the DreamHack Winter major, by this point in time, they didn't even get out the group. They were 9th to 12th. Then they went to ESCA Season 17, got upset by the Denial team with a bunch of players that you would definitely know because they went on to be in teams like Team Liquid, Optic, NRG later in their careers. Now, the interesting thing about Hiko, a defining factor that made him very unique at the time, is the NA players that were in the Days teams were really skilled, but played very loose CS and were kind of a bit arrogant. Then the players in the Complexity / Cloud9 team, basically, yeah, they had Hiko and Shroud as like skilled players, but that team was a bit more messy because Semphis was like very gamble heavy and would like do lots of force spies. Nothing was all over the place, and there was a little bit of a scatterbrain in terms of the tactics. Showgaz was trying to call super duper tactics, but you also have to say, you know, a lot of his teams never really won at the biggest level. I also thought he was a pretty good IGL to a certain point in time. Maybe he catered to the players too much because he was too much of a nice guy. So there was a vibe of like, does this team really want to win? Like, they're good, but have they got the killer instinct? Like, is this the best lineup? And so Hiko, outright, that's why I used to say that slogan, Hiko was right. He basically decided to leave the team. I heard he basically got offered he could cut everyone and just make a new team himself in Cloud9, but he chose not to do that. And as you'll see later with the simple move, this guy was really willing, in my opinion, to do almost everything to win. Now, there were certain small periods where he took the money, like the Neelam one, but overall, he was trying to make the ruthless moves that put you in a chance to win, because at the time, no NA team beyond that Cologne run was going to win a major or be number 1 in the world. And it should have been possible with the talent, quite frankly. In the first of my Reflections interviews with him, you can kind of see that particular period of time. Then, after leaving Cloud9, the reason he did it was to go and make an iBuyPower super team. So they kept Dazed, the IGL, who's a fragging IGL, Swag, the young talent who'd been with him in Complexity, Skadoodle, arguably the best NA player at the time, superstar AWPA potential, AZK, who's a pretty good player from Source and a good rifler, and obviously in came Hiko to be the clutch master and make this new NA super team. The problem is they only played a couple of qualifiers, and then everyone except for Skadoodle and Hiko got literally banned from the game in the iBuyPower match fixing ban. Then, him and Skadoodle at the time were supposed to be a package, and they were being shopped around to all the big top teams, and it was going to be like, who could bid more? And if they stayed together, you got one of the best players in an AWPA, one of the best players in a lurker and a clutcher. That should be the basis for potentially a really good international team. So they actually went and stood in together for Elevate at the CEVO 6 LAN finals, made it to second place. The problem is, Skadoodle got offered a 10k signing bonus, which at the time was megabucks by Cloud9, and so he just joined Cloud9, which did become a very good team by the summer, but it left Hiko just out on his own, and he had a bunch of options. And initially, he went to his old mate Semphis, who'd already been cut from Cloud9, in a team called Neelam, which had a lot of funding. It also, interestingly, had a player called Automatic, who hadn't yet become a star player, would later win the Boston Major. In Neelam, it was basically a team where the other players didn't really have any business playing still. One of them was Valens, who later became a coach and like a data nerd. The other players weren't good enough, and they were all right in online play, but they weren't a team that was going to be good online, unfortunately. Then later in the year, he actually got this bizarre offer where Flipside, the second or third best like CIS team, came up with Blade and Simple, now coach and superstar of Na'Vi in the current day. When they obviously Simple was way younger and Blade was more of like an old school IGL, they came over to ESWC, which was held in Montreal in Canada, and they needed a stand-in last minute. And basically, somehow Hiko got to be that stand-in. I think it's because the flip side, like management people were from NA and they knew him somehow. So even though he doesn't understand Russian, he was standing in on a team that speaks Russian with a bunch of players that don't speak very good English. But they managed to make top 4 at ESWC, which yes, was lacking a couple of top teams like Fnatic and maybe TSM, I think. But the thing is, NIP was there, who was still like 5th best team in the world or 6th best team in the world. And they beat NIP with Hiko as a stand-in in a best of 3 online. Now, true, they did have Simple even back then. Then after that, he went and joined Team Liquid, who at the time weren't a powerhouse team. They were like a decent team with some young players, an old player and a Dren from Source. And so they had a Dren as the IGL. They had Fugly, sort of a supportive element. Nitro was actually thought to be the star player and aimer. And Elise, who actually I think went on to become the best NA player ever, basically was sort of like, it was up to like, oh, how will he partner with Nitro and engage them? And then Hiko was again the lurker and the clutcher. Now this showed the mentality he had to be a winner. Because what he did in taking this core is, I remember even talking to him, it was like, right, we're going to have to literally put him to the test in tournaments, see who isn't going to make it, and start to gradually make the 1 or 2 player changes that get us to a better place. So this team was good online, it was good in NA, but actually it struggled internationally. It wouldn't really have that great in terms of placings. At the major, DreamHack Cluj-Napoca, which they qualified for, they just finished top 16, which means the group stage. They had a pretty hard group, admittedly, but they didn't manage to upset like some of the other squads like Cloud9 had been doing earlier. Then there was the tournament in NA called RGN Pro Series, where there was this whole drama. I think that was the tournament. I don't think it was the iBuyPower one, where they had this drama with the Brazilians of Luminosity, who weren't the best team yet. They made the changes they would at the end of the year, and it was claimed that like someone kicked the cable out, and then Hiko said he didn't want to do the restart because the admin said you don't have to, but they were being too cowardly and going, it's up to you though, if you agree you can do it. So all Brazilians were hating on him, which by the way, years later, when he went to Brazil, he had to basically have bodyguards because everyone had been doing death threats to him and his family on fucking Facebook. So then there was a tournament, IEM San Jose in NA. Now, they managed to finish top 4 here, which sounds good, but they beat Virtus Pro. Yes, one of the best teams in the world, but Virtus Pro, I think, didn't have snacks. And so it's like in that scenario, they had like old school Cuban standing in. I think it was their coach at the time. So that's a whatever. And then they lost to Na'Vi, sadly, in the semi-finals. Then, the next year, he made the big power move. I remember talking to him and we were brainstorming, who could we get? Like, got to be a European player, right? But who would be good enough? And we figured it has to be Simple. You've already played with him in Flipside. His skill level is unbelievable. Yes, as far as we could tell, he was an absolute dickhead as a teammate. And I've heard the comments in this team, he was bad. And I've heard some of the things from Flipside, and it weren't good. But I will say this, his skill was so unbelievable. So it's like prime Antonio Brown. You just take the problems. Randy Moss, these sorts of talents we're talking about. And when they got him, they narrowly qualified for the MLG Major. But at the MLG Major, they had a fucking unbelievable run. They got into the playoffs and beat CLG. They managed to play an NA team, actually, in the playoffs. Simple was carrying. In the semi-finals, they played Luminosity Gaming, who at the time was like the 3rd best team in the world behind Na'Vi and Fnatic in that order. Now, interestingly enough, as in Na'Vi 2, Fnatic 1, they actually, in both maps of this semi-final, Team Liquid got to map point. They got to 15 rounds, only to both times lose back, I think it was like 15-9, 15-6, to overtime, and then unfortunately lose in overtime because the Brazilians were more clutch. Brazilians had Coldzera, the best player in the world. Simple was more up and down in that one. Hiko was up and down like in the second map of Cash. He was carrying super hard the first half. Then he barely got a kill in the second half. Now, he did have an unbelievable round where he did like a 1v4 against the Brazilians that should have just almost been impossible. That was so epic. But that was in the first half of the game. So even though they got 2-0 and Luminosity went on to win the major, there's very much a world in which he's already in a major final again at this point in time, and I think they would have had a chance to beat Na'Vi because Na'Vi's star player, Guardian, actually had a fucked wrist and was using 3.5 times his normal sensitivity, so it wouldn't be impossible. Simple might have been able, I think Simple would have outplayed him, but so the rest of the team would have held their nerve. So there's a world, by the way, in Hiko's career, when you later find out about the Cologne run, he could actually have been in not only 2 or 3 major finals, he could actually have won a couple of majors. Yes, as a dark horse, but it could have happened. Also, there's obviously a world where you might have just never even made the semis and the finals. You could lose when you're the underdog and you won, right? Now, after this tournament, unfortunately, they bombed at DreamHack Masters Malmo. They had a new player called Kusta coming in instead of a Dren. There was all drama with him. Who's going to AWP? Simple or him? Simple wanted to take it away from him when he thought it wasn't good enough. Kusta did struggle in this team, and it took many years before he got good. Then after that, Simple just left and said, I want to go back to Ukraine. So in comes the Dren again. Who knows why? The team doesn't do very well. But they managed to get, because Simple had the hookup with Hiko, they managed to get Simple, who can't get into a top team back home, to come and stand in for 2 big international events. There's ECS Season 2 finals, where they just made it to 5th to 6th. There was only 8 teams there. And then they go to the major, ESL 1 Cologne 2016. Now, this is one of the all-time miracle runs. Because on paper, they weren't even supposed to get out of their group, necessarily. They get out of their group. They managed to beat Na'Vi in the quarterfinals, still like a top 3 team in the world. Simple goes mental. In the semis, they play Fnatic, and Simple has that epic 1v2. They win that game, carrying. They go to the final and play SK Gaming, the best team in the world, who are about to establish an era, but unfortunately get dropped in the final. SK Gaming wins, but now Hiko's been in a major final as well as 2 semi-finals already. At this point, he is far and away the most decorated NA player that we've had in CSGO. Now, because he was a stand-in, and he did so well, and he beat Na'Vi, and then Na'Vi went and didn't win E-League Season 1. Simple got the offer for Na'Vi. He went away. He didn't sign with Team Liquid, and that kind of merged into, that kind of broke apart, rather, what could have been one of the most exciting experiments ever in terms of a superstar player in NA. Now, I did a second reflections right after this period where we talk about all this, and was it possible Simple could have stayed? Now, funnily enough, when it comes to Hiko, it's kind of like Gamersups and one of their flavours, because man go meta, right? This man goes as the meta goes. If the meta allows a lurker, like the first few years did, a hard lurker, he's one of the best in the game. If the meta becomes a lot more up-tempo, you lurk or you entry, depending on what side of the map you're on, yeah, maybe it's not quite as good for him. Certainly was delicious when he was one of the best players in NA, though. Code Thorin, Thorin, for 10% off Gamersups at gamersups.gg. Link in the description box below. Now, after this, when they lost Simple, you can't replace Simple, but they didn't even try to. What they did was, Kozilij essentially sort of was like, I can be the star player. By the way, props to him, he did become the superstar player. They had Simple, Nitro's still there, so they brought in Pimp, a former second star from Western Wolves and teams in past years, but now, and Dignitas, he was second or first star, and now he comes in though to basically be a supportive element, which sort of worked, just they maybe didn't have quite as much firepower as you would have had with Simple. Now with this lineup, they had a pretty good run off the bat actually at ESL New York. They managed to place ahead of the Astralis team at the time, they made top 4, but they had to play Na'Vi in the semis, they won 1 map, and then they basically got beaten, and Na'Vi won that event, funnily enough, with Simple, and he won the tournament. After that, it was underwhelming results. There's also the time when Peacemaker was the coach. He could call for them at ESL 1 Cologne, but after ESL Cologne, Valve made the coaching change and he had to just become the coach, which unfortunately meant that Nitro and Hiko would take turns being IGL, and that didn't really work for either side, quite frankly, because of their playing style and role in the team. Then he got kicked after the E-League major in early 2017 because his game was going down. He wasn't the same star player he was in years gone by, and they didn't have the factor where they needed him to keep Simple. He joined up with Optic, who'd been one of the top teams at the end of the year, but Stanislaw, their IGL, had actually left, funnily enough, to go to Team Liquid instead of Hiko, so it was kind of one of those reverse trades. And so I think they tried making him the IGL in Optic for a while, but it just didn't work, so they let him go. Then he ended up basically in a team called Rogue. Now at the time, this should never have had any relevance again. It was an okay line. It had Cadian, who's obviously now in Heroica top team, but at the time was just like a journeyman in the Danish scene. It had a bunch of NA talents, like Shinobi was an okay IGL at the invite level. A guy called Vice was supposed to be like a young fragger who was coming up, and then a guy called Wrath was really young, but people said had good mechanics. Later, they would make the swap. They'd bring in Sick, a guy who was like a better version of Wrath and Vice, basically, young mechanics, pretty good. He was supposed to be comparable in generation to Twist, who became one of the best players ever. They brought in Ricky, who'd been an Australian player from the Renegades team, to sort of be like a streaky AWPer. And actually, during their best period, they managed to finish second at DreamHack Austin. Not a bad run, actually. It was mainly tier 2 teams, but some decent, top 20 EU teams. At the minor, they finished second, so they qualified. They went to another major in Hiko's career, Face It Major London, but they didn't make an impact on that tournament. At DreamHack Atlanta, on paper it looks bad in an 8-team tournament to finish 5th to 6th. But you have to realise they lost a best of 1 to, I think, Steele's Ghost team. And then they lost a best of 3 to Vitality, who had Zero later to become one of the best players ever, and a whole bunch of veteran French players who won majors together. So that wasn't even that bad a result. Then, in the end of his CSGO career, he played with a team called Zipug Gods. So you had Android, who'd been in Complexity, a guy called CJ and Ultra, who don't know that well. Drone, who actually in later years was a half-decent player for some of the sort of like 6th and 7th best NA teams. And that was basically the end of Hiko's career, because it was basically right the year that before he came over to Valorant. The key theme in Hiko's career was his mentality. Just as in clutches, he was ruthless, he had a killer mindset. That's what he was like in terms of a player and how he treated teammates and how he treated the idea of winning. He would make the right move, whether it was political, whether it's the nice guy move. He wanted to win, and there's a reason why he had a whole bunch of very impressive performances the first years of his career, while other people went up and down, and people got banned, and people were good, but then they fell off and made the wrong moves. Some other people had different methods. Also, another thing he was famous for in 1.6 was being a pretty big streamer. He understood streaming and branding and the hours you do, and getting people there to feel like they're part of something. So it doesn't surprise me in Valorant he's successful as a streamer. It doesn't surprise me with the lesser talent at the moment, and still learning the game, that he is this amazing clutch player, that he is able to be a lurker, that he's able to exploit his game. I've actually heard individually you can kind of do a little bit more without needing as much team help, so maybe that's why he can get away with being a lurker. I'm interested to follow his career, even though I don't know that much about the game. That is who Hiko is.
Hey, I'm Hiko, the Master Baiter, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
This video was kindly supported by Kris with a K, Lager15, Matt Pugnatio, Rajcula, Scaparan, Travis Goff, Zack Schmidt, Adam Ochs, Alexander Rao, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Kris, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, John Shelton, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and special thanks go out to both Jerky's Minion and DZL. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for some of my content? Want to ask me a question in one of those video AMAs? Do you want teasers? Who's going to be the guests on my next interviews? Do you want to take part in a lengthy esports discussion with me? Well, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.